Thank you very much for joining us today for another Shift webinar. We will be sharing a talk that we gave a few weeks ago at Eurobike, looking into a piece of research that we did around enthusiasts, road, gravel, mountain bike, and specifically what do they think and feel about e-bikes. You'll be hearing from myself and Matt today. We will, with respect to everyone's time, try and keep it under half hour as booked into the schedule. So we'll look to try and present for around 20 minutes and then leave 5 to 10 minutes at the end to take questions. So if anything that we share today prompts a question, or if there's a broader question you have around this topic, please do use the Q&A functionality at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And Matt will pick out and we'll try and answer as many of the questions as we can. Right, we'll crack on with the presentation in a minute, but just for those who aren't as familiar with us, just got a quick introduction to Shift and also the people who are presenting in the room, just give you a bit of context about who we are. So we are a data-driven marketing agency dedicated exclusively to cycling and the outdoors. We are based in lovely and occasionally sunny Bath in the UK. Our services span from the more research consultative end, working with clients on their long-term visions and plans, to world-class activations through PR, media, creative, and social. As I mentioned, we are based in the UK, but the majority of our client base is actually from across the world. So we service and work with clients everywhere from Taipei through to California and everywhere in between, across 10 countries and 7 languages. In terms of the scale of who we are, about 35 staff in our office. We work with over 40 clients. From the point of view of research, we've actually surveyed over 650,000 cyclists in the last 5 years. I think we've probably spent more time talking to cyclists than anyone else. We've invested a significant amount of money for clients in paid media. We're very proud to be both Google and Meta partners, which gives us access to early product tests and support. And we've had a significant number of clients and launches over the last years, lots of impacts and some brilliant creative projects. So full service, but very focused on cycling outdoors. One other thing that's probably worth sharing before we dive into it is also the Rider Research Hub. So the Rider Research Hub is our proprietary cycling-specific panel. I mean, created primarily out of frustration ourselves as we were looking for consistent, high-quality, validated enthusiast cyclists. So people who commit, time, passion, and money into the sport that we love. But it was just very hard to find these sorts of responses consistently in more mainstream panels. So we set up and are now running this panel and this community. We have over it's actually 8,500 members at the moment and growing. And we've recruited from a really good balanced list of places, from our own data list to industry partnerships, digital recruitment and events. So we've got a nice broad representation. It's got respondents from North America, Europe and the UK. We will look to expand that in the future, but this is where we started due to what we were being asked by clients. Now, this is relevant because also this is the group of, this is the audience that helped us do this piece of research and dig into the question that we are answering today. Finally, just for those who haven't met us before, hello, I'm Doug. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer, so responsible for everything to do with data insights and then working and collaborating with our clients to help turn those insights into longer term visions for their brands and organizations. And in my team is?
I'm Matt. I'm the Research Director at Shift, responsible for all research projects and the Rider Research Hub community.
And there we are with our helmets on. Safety first. So the reason we got to this question, we talked about this topic at Eurobike, was that we'd done a lot of work around, we've seen lots of pieces of work on how general populations feel about e-bikes. And it's really important because, think about long-term adoption of e-bikes and active transport is really important to the industry and also for people as well. But as a company that spends a lot of time thinking about the enthusiasts who commit so much time, money, and passion to the love of two wheels, we hadn't seen as much around a more comprehensive study about, well, what do enthusiasts who already love cycling think and feel about e-bikes? We've done a bit on mountain bike and EMTB, but we haven't really done something broader to try and look at all those disciplines at once. So that was essentially the test we kind of gave ourselves, was let's go and work with our community of enthusiasts and understand how they relate to e-bikes and how they therefore should be thought about when organizations, bike brands, and everyone else around the industry are trying to communicate, build products for and engage this audience.
So with that in mind, in June of this year, we conducted a survey with the members of our panel and gathered nearly 1,400 responses on a range of questions really relating to their relationships with e-bikes. So that included whether they already owned or had any interest in purchasing an e-bike, what types of bikes they owned or were considering, a little bit about why they would want an e-bike, but also crucially their role as an enthusiast cyclist on influencing others. We found that enthusiasts weren't necessarily more likely to want an e-bike, despite already having that passion, that commitment of time and money that Doug already mentioned for cycling. In fact, around half said that they weren't interested at all. And this mirrors a similar rate that we've seen in non-enthusiast samples, both in terms of research that we've done here at Shift, but also broader research, both in the UK and Germany, being around a similar proportion. But it is clear from this chart and from other data within this presentation that that's not the case for all enthusiasts. And in fact, e-bike consideration varies very much by group. So our expectations going in were very much reinforced in terms of the types of riders who would be interested, particularly leisure, recreational, mountain bike riders. I think there does seem to still be a preconception within the industry that e-bike appeal grows the older you get. We didn't see that necessarily being the case among our enthusiast sample, and in fact, there's less opportunity with older riders, so those over 60, and the biggest opportunity coming among 30 to 49-year-olds. Among the non-owners, the intent to buy an e-bike is higher in Europe than the other regions. And crucially, that desire to act on this intent within the next year is particularly prominent. So of those considering an e-bike in each of these regions, 50% in Europe were considering purchasing in the next year, dropping down to 37% in the UK and 27% in North America. So Europe is definitely a key region, and UK and North America, it appears there's still a little bit more work to do to drive that love for the e-bike among enthusiast riders.
Which kind of reflects what we see in the more mainstream audience as well, yeah.
So in terms of the things that were preventing people who were considering an e-bike from buying it, being able to afford it is the main barrier, but this is lower in Europe compared to the other regions, and that's despite the fact that typically there's a higher average selling price in Europe, but that's likely linked to the fact that those who are considering in Europe are considering purchasing in a more shorter time period, so in the next 12 months, so are likely less put off by the cost and have the finances in place in order to do so. Outside of the cost, there is a desire to try an e-bike before purchasing, as well as some uncertainty even among enthusiasts as to what e-bike to buy, particularly in North America and the UK. And again, this reflects what we see in a more mainstream audience, in that people want to try e-bikes, they don't necessarily know what e-bike they want or need. So we're seeing that among people who are very much involved in cycling, have spent a lot of money on their current non-electric bike, but they still have some of those shared concerns that a mainstream audience has. We went in expecting that mountain bike riders would be more interested certainly in e-bikes and EMTBs, and that was the case. And it was also our expectation going in that they would want to use any electric bike for MTB riding. And again, that was something which the data went on to demonstrate. But what was interesting to us was among road riders, there was a much broader spread of the type of e-bikes that they were looking for. So e-road, yes, but also e-hybrid, e-gravel, even EMTB. And this was also the case when we asked people how they plan to ride their e-bike. Mountain bike riders much clearer on their intent to use it across different mountain bike styles, while road riders had a much more varied plan, including things like leisure riding and transport riding. So much less of an electrification of what they were currently doing, and more a way to vary their riding.
one thing we really wanted to know was whether e-bikes were seen as a replacement for an existing bike or type of riding, or whether this was going to be something that's additive to someone's riding life and their collection of bikes. I think both owners and intenders, a majority quite clearly indicated that it is more likely to be an addition to the bikes they already own rather than a full like-for-like replacement. So just allowing you to keep cycling when you've given up another form of cycling. It is far more pronounced among the intenders. So partly it may well be that, there's a certain group of e-bike owners who were potentially sort of led to require an e-bike for whatever reason. So actually it was more a chance of being forced to, and therefore higher number of replacements. But either way, we see that actually the e-bike is more often than not an addition to a collection than a new one, which again is, very relatable as a cyclist because the number of bikes you always want is more than you currently have. So it's good to know that e-bikes don't change that for enthusiasts, and also a nice reflection of the fact these are proper enthusiasts, always wanting more bikes. I think what's interesting though about that is that then also comes through when we begin to ask about how do you imagine e-bike will change the way that an e-bike will change the way that you ride. So the most common single answer was actually that it hasn't changed the way that they ride, or it won't change the way that they ride, because the 63% of their changes then splits into lots of different reasons. So the single biggest reason is it hasn't or it won't, which goes back to that previous slide. Was actually potentially it's not necessarily just about replacing, it's about continuing to ride, but just adding a little bit more to it. So when we break down those people who said it has changed how they ride, we then group those responses into a certain number of categories. So the most common response for those who found that e-bikes had changed, or they thought would change their riding style, was this theme around further, faster, easier. So essentially more riding. So I'll be able to do more with that, more with my time. I'll get further, I'll ride more often. Actually, quite often that prompted people to then say they rode more often than they had before they got their e-bike. 12% is told us that it was essentially for transport, whether that's of children, of cargo, replacing a car. So those themes all coming through, which again we see across a wider audience. But actually, when you tend to see people talking about e-bikes in mainstream, whether that's organizations or when you're talking about why people might get one, it tends to play a bigger role. So obviously, these are an enthusiast audience. So passion and fun and getting more out of a bike than purely practical transport was more important. Only 7% actually talked about keeping cycling. So traditionally, Matt mentioned earlier, we do tend to assume that there's this sort of linear correlation. The older you get, the more likely you are to want an e-bike. We didn't really find that. And actually, it was actually only a relatively small group of this sample that said that it was just to keep cycling. It was purely it just changed. They weren't necessarily doing different riding, but they just found riding so much more enjoyable. And the final point, which is very closely tied to EMTB, was around gravity and actually, interestingly, skill. And we'll come on to a bit more about that in a second. So below each of these themes, we then saw a number of sub-themes and comments that came out. And we've broken these out into just begin to illustrate what they are. A lot of them do actually reflect the same things that we'll see or hear from a more mainstream audience when they talk about adoption of e-bike or trying e-bike. So whether it is, because it's further, faster, and they can go further, it's faster, it can be more easier, they do ride more. They can take on more challenging terrain, and go longer or ride more. From a transport point of view, kind of touched on these already. The only other practical one we talked about was we had several very specific comments about being able to turn up to the office without being so sweaty that colleagues didn't sort of move away from you in the office. I think keeping cycling there was a combination of age and just general health issue, but then also keeping up with specific faster riders, quite often people in the family as well, to try and keep family groups together. And then enjoyable and the idea of the which is tied to enjoyment, the fact that EMTB is obviously your own uplift and you can get more downhill laps though. We have though also pulled out a few other ones. You can see just highlighted here, either in the bright yellow or black in the case of injury. And actually those ones just came through and stood out as ones we didn't really see when we talked to a more mainstream audience around these sorts of subjects. So just bring those to life a bit more with specific quotes. So one of the things about keeping cycling was that we tend to associate that with either chronic health limitations or age, and those things are true. But actually, what's interesting is that injury came up as an idea about e-bike can help you keep cycling either from when, again, so like, more middle-aged and older audiences, sometimes when you've gone for a long ride, then don't want to go back on your bike because you need to recover. This is quite relatable. Actually, sometimes an e-bike is an alternative to keep cycling even when you don't have as much freshness, or when you're specifically recovering from injury, with the plan that you'll then go back to cycling your regular non-e-bike in the future. So the idea of injury or the factors like e-bike can play that like supporting role whilst still staying on the other bike or bikes. When we talk about further and faster, the theme that really came through that I hadn't seen as much from more mainstream research is this idea of exploration, the passion and excitement of actually not necessarily just the pure fact of being able to go further or that's easier to ride, but what you can then do with it. So exploring trails that you never would have reached before, actually, and also just to highlight, these aren't sometimes small explorations. These can be pretty epic adventures people are having with e-bikes. So one respondent talked about a great ride they did from Washington, D.C. to Pittsburgh, 334 miles on an e-bike. These aren't people just potting around locally. They're pushing themselves, even though they're on an e-bike. I think that we touched on this point a couple of times already, but actually this idea of variety. So the ability to add an e-bike to just another type of riding, help you do a different sort, which is touched on in some other places. But the fact that e-bike's fun and can be an addition to the way that you already ride. And actually, people talked about confidence. So a couple of people talked about actually how riding an e-bike and that extra speed and more frequency of riding then actually made them more confident to take on longer and more challenging terrain and push themselves a bit further. But actually also we had one respondent who talked about that actually they've become more confident on their non-e-bike because of what the e-bike has helped them done and spend more time on the bike. And finally, I think it's super interesting. Several MTB respondents talked about, we hear a lot about the chance to do more laps at a bike park or sort of be able to go up the climbs and spend more time on the fun bit downhill. But actually, people were talking about the fact that the other benefit of that is that they get more skillful because they get more repetitions. Obviously, off-road riding is as much about skill as athletic ability, but they get more practice, but they also get the top of those runs more rested. So because they're more rested, they are able to sort of maintain their form and their skills. So their technique doesn't suffer. So actually EMTB, and it's not something I've really seen anyone talk about from a brand point of view, is this idea that an EMTB is not just an easy way to get back up for more runs and more fun. It actually can make you a better rider. Now, obviously, these are the people who are considering or already own an e-bike. But actually, I think what's positive from our point of view is that even if e-bikes aren't seen as something for me as an enthusiast, our respondents tended to still be positive about e-bikes. When we kind of asked this question about cheating a few years ago, it was a much higher figure. Now, 83% don't believe that riding an e-bike is cheating. There's always going to be some holdouts. But this is overall, this is seen as like an e-bike has a clear role. It's not about it being something you shouldn't do. It just plays a role for different people. I think it's particularly true in MTB. I think what we were hoping that we'd see a slightly more positive response on, but it is positive overall, is that 65% believe that e-bikes are a useful alternative form of transport to reduce emissions. And 58% think that e-bikes are a good way to get people into cycling. Now, I think partly that shows that we as an industry still have work to do with our own kind of like engaged cycling base already to make them more positive about e-bikes. But it also shows that they're beginning to show the love for e-bikes, even as it is. But the reason we should care about persuading even those who aren't trying to buy an e-bike right now that e-bikes are this positive force that we believe they are, is that they are actually a really interesting and considerable influence on others who are buying e-bikes. So just under half have been asked their opinions on e-bikes by others, and e-bike owners are highly likely to recommend e-bikes. So these are enthusiasts, both owners and non, and they are a form of recommendation. And, from separate pieces of research, we know that personal recommendation is one of the most convincing ways that people choose a particular product, a particular brand, not just go into and buy into a specific category. So it makes sense from a category point of view, but it does make sense from a brand point of view as well. E-bike owners, how do they sort of like then show this influence? They'll actually talk to others about their bike, but also quite often they become like a mobile test ride service. So there is a job here of actually trying to build scale in particular regions for brands, because you do then have this advocacy effect going on in local markets. And then from a non-e-bike owner's point of view, even if they don't own one, they are going out and doing some proactive recommendation. They might be recommending specific bike shops, which again, we think is good, because quite often an enthusiast is going to try and make sure they recommend good quality bike shops, make sure that they get to sort of arm their whoever's asked them the question with some good advice, and also share what experiences they have had with e-bikes. They're more likely to steer them towards quality brands, quality buying experiences, and therefore have that person end up with an e-bike that is better for them and is better experience overall. So I think that there is a real case of making sure that we don't cut out enthusiasts for when we're thinking about building the reputation of your brand for high quality e-bikes in more of a specialist media or a social space where we talk to these audiences ongoing. So a couple of minutes just to wrap up some final thoughts, and then maybe some questions in the last 5 minutes. So try and simplify it with just, if you're going to take away anything from this, I think these are the three sort of takeaways we've done. The first is that e-bike interest does vary significantly by sub-audience. So high EMTB interest amongst MTB riders, and it's very focused on EMTB. So in many ways, I think that's part of the industry that has been it's much quicker to embrace EMTB, and that's kind of like played out. What is more interesting is that roadies aren't necessarily significantly less likely to be interested in e-bikes. It's just that their interest is very fragmented across different types of riding. They're more curious around a range of things that e-bikes can do for them. And therefore, it's going to be a little bit more of a considered approach for brands in terms of product development, and then also how you communicate to this more sort of drop bar road-focused audience. Also, I think it's really exciting for us that this age range, the core target age range, is also in the core age range of a lot of this enthusiast market. So this 30 to 49, relatively high spending, very engaged with cycling generally. So it is like our industry sweet spot anyway, and we don't just have to wait for it to be just sort of an older audience. I think e-bikes, I think the biggest thing when you think about positioning or about product development is actually just this idea about enriching their riding lives. This isn't, sometimes it is a practical purchase, but actually more often than not, this is about enjoyment and about adding new things to their riding lives. So we've seen that it's more likely to be an addition than a straight replacement. But actually, for those who do say things are going to change, they focus on more. Like, what can this e-bike give you? And it's not necessarily just that it will make you feel faster. You'll practically get to somewhere quicker. You can carry more stuff. It's about adventure. It's about variety. It's about confidence. It's about building your skills. These are all like really positive, experiential things, and very emotive things that the industry can be pushing and talking about more often as the benefits of what people can get from e-bikes, and not just maybe talk about engine watts or tire specifications. Finally, I think the other thing is, even if they're not buying an e-bike, enthusiasts can be positive e-bike allies, because even the rejectors are quite positive at e-bikes, but there is some work to do there still. And also they are quite likely to be a purchase influence on other e-bike buyers. So making sure that e-bike plans, reputations, propositions, what we're going to stand for, the quality of the bikes, whatever you're talking about when you're talking about e-bikes, make sure that you're not invisible to enthusiasts, even if traditionally maybe you don't sit inside the enthusiast bubble. You are more focused on a mainstream audience. There is a value to the enthusiast for all bike brands. So that's the end of our quick keynote from Eurobike. Hopefully that was interesting. Matt, are there any questions?
No questions currently.
Okay, we will give people a minute or so if they would like to submit any questions they have about the data we've shared. Otherwise, we can give people a little bit of their lives back.
We do have a question on whether we think there's any brands that are doing this well.
Well, in terms of e-bikes appealing to enthusiasts, I would say that it's most common amongst MTB brands, because there has been a very clear, I think because they've been quicker to embrace the fun side. And also there's not some limitations there are with, say, e-road, where actually the speed limitations in certain markets mean that it doesn't actually make practical sense to ride e-road for a lot of riders. I think that they've done a really good job, and I think the mountain bike brands have, maybe just by the natural culture of mountain bike, lent more into the fun and the excitement and the more emotive side of e-bikes. Whereas I think that on the road side and on the transport side, it has been relatively practical rather than necessarily leaning into that. So MTB on the whole has been focused on that. I think that actually for those who actually went to e-bike, or those that actually didn't, say the turn stand at Eurobike did a really good job of storytelling about the life you can live with an e-bike, I think, rather than just beauty shots of the product and then tech specs. So I think they've also done quite a good job more the experience side, which again, I think would translate quite well to an enthusiast audience as well.
Great, got a couple more questions. So in terms of the definition of enthusiasts that we use, so when people join the Rider Research Hub community, they have to fill in a short survey about their riding, and that covers a lot of different things. So how they ride, how often they ride, what they've spent on their bike. Enthusiasts is broadly a kind of an amalgamation of most of those. They have to ride at least monthly. They typically have spent at least 1,500 euros minimum on their most expensive bike. We primarily see them in road, gravel, and mountain, and they're riding it, you know, not for sort of commuting purposes as a primary type of riding. They're not riding for commuting or leisure purposes. So hopefully that answers that question. In terms of having the data to explain the differences between enthusiasts versus other segments, I think it's a good question about what sets them apart. So the focus of this survey was very much with our community, which is enthusiasts. I think there is a lot of information out there on the kind of more broader general sample, general kind of non-enthusiast sample, in terms of where e-bike sales are, what people are kind of looking for there. And I think, again, you know, a lot of it was mirroring some of the things that we did see with enthusiasts. So there was quite a lot of commonality there in terms of some of the motivations, some like barriers around cost, things like wanting to try a bike before they buy it, not necessarily being sure. But I think, as Doug said as well, there were some really interesting things that came through that maybe we weren't expecting, that did separate the enthusiasts from the more mainstream audience, particularly in terms of those kind of like adding skill to how you ride, how predominantly road riders want to use an e-bike and things like that. So yeah, there were differences, but the mainstream audience weren't part of this specific study, so we don't have like the exact data point to counter that.
No, I think that some of the other studies we've generally found is that there are some things you'd also expect. So enthusiasts have a higher knowledge and awareness of what brands are in market beyond, say, the mass local brands, like say Gazelle in the Netherlands or Rally in the UK. They generally have a better knowledge of what good components are, what good brands are already, which they then take sometimes to their e-bike purchasing. I think the other thing is also this difference between necessarily looking actively for improving and broadening their riding lives, sometimes in quite emotive ways, whereas the language tends to be for a more mainstream audience. When you ask them what they're looking for, it tends to be solving very practical things, which is neither better or worse. It's just quite often the bike to them is a practical solution rather than necessarily something that they're yet passionate about. So that comes through. There's also usually a level of expectation of spend. So usually the enthusiast will have a better handle on what to expect to pay for different bikes. So, and are more likely to maybe buy in and spend a bit more. Whereas, I don't know, particularly say it's in the US market, whereas actually people are looking for that kind of $1,500 event on style bike, and actually the price of, say, something like a recent Muller would surprise those audiences as well. So there's a bit of sticker shock for some of those non-specialists as well, non-enthusiasts.
Sure. We've got a question on whether we feel e-bikes, especially EMTBs, enable a wider group of people to experience mountain biking for the first time. I think there's certainly, from other work we've done, that's come through. Speaking to people and doing other surveys on e-mountain bikes specifically, you know, anecdotally, lots of people that mountain bikers knew were getting into mountain biking through e-mountain biking. Obviously, you know, it takes away the need to think of yourself as necessarily being fit enough to cope with the climbs and things like that. Obviously, there are some sort of counters to that. Being able to handle a heavier bike and things like that can be more of a challenge. But I certainly think that there's an opportunity for it to bring more people into a sport and a discipline that they maybe haven't considered being for them, particularly if the sort of the climbing and the going back up to the top of laps, or being able to get out and do a lot of riding in maybe a shorter amount of time. I think that's a big thing for EMTB riders and people who we've spoken to are considering an EMTB. It's that ability to go out, do more laps in a shorter amount of time, fit more riding in, which we'd all like to do. That's, I think, is a really interesting one. So that definitely could open the door for people to get into mountain biking if one of their concerns is how much time it's going to take.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is it depends which group you talk to quite often, because when we've spoke to a more enthusiast base, like most EMTB riders had come from a mountain bike background of some sort. But when you broaden it out a bit more to this, I guess, like SUV mountain bike audience, so people using mountain bikes, but to ride, I guess, gentler trails, that I think has brought people in. But then anecdotally, we have heard about people's amazing journeys from not riding a bike at all to trying EMTB to like really getting into it and that evolving their relationship with the bike overall. So I think that depending on which category of MTB, some come more from your traditional, I was a mountain bike rider, now I'm coming to EMTB. But there's definitely scope and there's proof in some areas that people are coming into MTB because the MTB makes it more accessible. Lighter weight bikes with reliable motors without too much range anxiety is going to help that as well. So I think that the development of the bikes themselves to be lighter but still capable is going to be a really big part of making that possible. Right, I think we've run slightly over. So thank you everyone very much for joining us today. Appreciate you got lots on at this time of day, wherever you are. So thanks for spending this half an hour with us. And all attendees will receive a copy of the presentation afterwards. So if you want to know anything more about us, our research services, or this study, then please just get in touch. Thanks very much.